The thing about military academies is that they're designed to break you down and build you back up into a proper soldier. The Galactic Naval Academy took this philosophy and cranked it up to 11, because apparently regular Earth military wasn't hardcore enough for space warfare. They had rules for everything: how you walked, how you talked, how you saluted, and, most importantly for our story, how you stayed awake during strategic warfare theory at 0800 hours every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Annika had missed that particular memo. Not because she was rebellious, mind you. The girl could follow orders when she wanted to. No, Annika had a more fundamental problem with the concept of consciousness during morning lectures. Specifically, she appeared to be allergic to it. Commander Harry stood at the front of Lecture Hall C, his weathered face twisted into what had become his permanent expression whenever Cadet Annika was in attendance. Which was to say, he looked like someone had just informed him that his favorite coffee shop had been replaced by a tax preparation office. "As I was saying," Harry continued, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for people who suspect they're being ignored by someone who's technically present but spiritually checked out. "The Meridian Campaign of 2387 demonstrated the critical importance of maintaining supply line integrity during extended deep space operations." In the third row, Annika's head had found that perfect angle against her palm that suggested she was paying rapt attention while actually being completely unconscious. Her dark hair fell across her face like a curtain, and if you didn't know better, you'd think she was taking very detailed notes on the lecture. In reality, she was probably dreaming about something infinitely more interesting, like watching paint dry, or perhaps contemplating the existential crisis of a particularly philosophical houseplant. Bree, sitting next to her, had perfected the art of looking attentive while actually serving as Annika's personal early warning system. She'd developed an impressive array of subtle nudges, coughs, and strategic paper rustling designed to wake her roommate whenever Harry's attention wandered too close to their section. "The key to understanding tactical flexibility," Harry was saying, pacing back and forth with the measured steps of a man who'd given this same lecture roughly 2,000 times, "is recognizing when conventional doctrine must be abandoned in favor of—" He paused mid-sentence. Not because he'd forgotten what he was saying. Harry could recite military doctrine in his sleep, but because something was wrong with this picture. His gaze swept across the lecture hall, taking in the appropriately attentive faces of future fleet officers, until it landed on the one cadet who looked like she was conducting a very important meeting with the back of her eyelids. "Cadet Annika," Harry said, his voice carrying, across the room with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years turning civilians into soldiers. Bree's elbow moved with surgical precision. Annika's head snapped up so fast it was a minor miracle she didn't give herself whiplash. Her eyes, still slightly unfocused, found Harry's face with the unerring accuracy of someone who'd been through this dance before. "Sir?" she said, and to her credit, she managed to sound like she'd been hanging on his every word, instead of exploring the fascinating world of unconsciousness. Harry's smile was the kind that made smart cadets start mentally rehearsing their apologies. "Perhaps you could enlighten us with your thoughts on Admiral Blackwood's tactical decisions during the siege of Kepler Station." Now, this is where things got interesting, because any normal cadet caught napping during strategic warfare theory would either admit defeat or try to bluff their way through with half-remembered fragments from last night's reading assignment. Annika, however, had never been accused of being normal. She straightened in her seat, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, so subtle that most of the class missed it entirely. But Harry had been watching her long enough to recognize the signs. It was like watching someone flip a switch from dormant to operational. Admiral Blackwood made a critical error in positioning his dreadnoughts in a defensive formation around the station, Annika said, her voice clear and confident. He was thinking in terms of protecting a fixed asset, when he should have been thinking about creating a tactical trap. Harry's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. This wasn't the response he'd been expecting. "Go on," he said, crossing his arms. Kepler Station was already compromised, Annika continued, seeming to warm up to the topic. The enemy had been planning their assault for months. Blackwood should have evacuated the civilian population, rigged the station with explosives, and used it as bait. Let the enemy commit their forces to taking what they thought was a strategic prize, then detonate the whole thing while their fleet was in close proximity. The lecture hall had gone very quiet. Even Bree was staring at her roommate with something approaching awe. That would have resulted in significant material losses, Harry pointed out, though his tone suggested he was more interested than critical. Annika shrugged. War is about acceptable losses. Blackwood lost the station anyway, plus 3 dreadnoughts and their entire crews. My way, he loses the station but takes out half the enemy fleet in the process. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a pawn to take a queen. Harry stared at her for a long moment. In 30 years of military service, he'd taught thousands of cadets. Most of them could recite doctrine well enough, and a few even showed genuine tactical insight. But this was something different. This was the kind of thinking that either got you court-martialed or promoted to admiral, with very little middle ground between the two. "Interesting perspective, cadet," he said finally. "Though I notice you seem to have acquired this insight without the benefit of actually being awake during my lectures on the subject." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the class. Annika had the good grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I absorb information differently, sir," she said, which was possibly the most diplomatic way of saying, "I learn better when unconscious," that Harry had ever heard. "Differently," Harry repeated, his tone suggesting he was filing this information away for future reference. "Well, perhaps your unique learning style will serve you well in your final examination next week." The lecture continued, but something had changed. Word would spread, as it always did in the closed ecosystem of a military academy. The sleeping cadet in strategic warfare theory had just demonstrated a grasp of tactical thinking that most graduating officers would envy. It was the kind of story that got embellished with each telling until it became the stuff of academy legend. What none of them knew, not Harry, not Bree, not even Annika herself, was that in exactly 18 days, humanity would face its first major interstellar war. And all those perfectly disciplined, traditionally trained officers with their textbook knowledge and regulation procedures would find themselves completely, utterly, and spectacularly outmatched. But the girl who slept through strategy class? She was about to become their only hope. Later that evening, in the cramped dormitory room they shared in Academy Housing Block D, Bree finally asked the question that had been bothering her all day. "How do you do it?" she said, looking up from her tactical theory textbook. "And don't give me that 'I absorb information differently' nonsense. I've seen you sleep through entire semesters, Annika. Yet somehow you know more about military strategy than cadets who've been studying it since they were 12. Annika was lying on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling with the kind of intense concentration most people reserved for solving complex mathematical equations. Which, knowing Annika, she probably was. "I dream about it," she said finally. "You what?" I dream about battles, Annika explained, rolling over to face her roommate. Not like normal dreams where nothing makes sense and you're suddenly naked in front of your high school algebra class. I mean detailed, tactical simulations. Fleets moving in formation, supply lines, communication delays, weapon effectiveness at various ranges. It's all there. Bree stared at her. That's not normal, Annika. Tell me about it. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to fight the Battle of Wolf 359 every single night? I wake up more tired than when I went to bed. Have you told anyone about this? Annika snorted. Right. Excuse me, Commander Harry, but I'd like to report that I'm receiving tactical intelligence through my dreams. That would go over well. They'd have me in the Academy's psych ward faster than you could say, Section 8. Bree considered this. Maybe you should keep it to yourself. That's the plan. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside their window, the lights of other dormitory buildings twinkled like earthbound stars. Somewhere in those buildings, future admirals and fleet commanders were studying their textbooks, memorizing regulations, and preparing for careers in a military that valued discipline, tradition, and following established protocols. None of them were dreaming of battles that hadn't happened yet. 3 days later, long-range sensors detected something that made Admiral Morrison's morning coffee taste like ash in his mouth. A fleet, if you could call something that massive a mere fleet, had appeared at the edge of the Proxima Centauri system. The ships were unlike anything in human-design databases. Sleek, organic-looking vessels that seemed to shift and flow like living creatures. The Helix Consortium had found them. Morrison had been expecting this day for months. Intelligence reports had suggested that humanity's expansion into formerly unclaimed systems had attracted the attention of less friendly neighbors. The Helix were rumored to be a militaristic civilization that viewed any encroachment on their territory as an act of war worthy of total annihilation. Apparently, the rumors were true. The first battle lasted exactly 18 minutes. The human defense fleet, composed of 3 heavy cruisers and a handful of support vessels, engaged the enemy using standard tactical doctrine. They maintained proper formation, followed established engagement protocols, and executed their maneuvers with the precision that had made human naval forces legendary throughout known space. It didn't matter. The Helix ships moved like nothing Morrison had ever seen. They seemed to anticipate every human tactic, countering each maneuver before it was fully executed. Worse, their technology appeared to adapt in real time. Weapons that had been effective in the opening minutes of the battle became useless as the enemy vessels modified their defenses. When the shooting stopped, humanity had lost 2 cruisers and suffered heavy damage to the 3rd. The Helix fleet hadn't lost a single ship. Admiral Morrison sat in his command center, staring at the tactical display with the expression of a man who'd just watched everything he thought he knew about warfare get thrown out the nearest airlock. Around him, his staff worked frantically to process damage reports and casualty figures. "Sir," his aide said quietly, "we're receiving a transmission from the Helix fleet." Morrison nodded grimly. "Put it through." The main display shimmered, and suddenly they were looking at something that might have been a face if you were feeling generous with your definition of the term. General Korth of the Helix Consortium had the kind of features that suggested his species had evolved from something with entirely too many teeth and a serious attitude problem. "Humans," Korth said, his voice carrying the kind of casual disdain usually reserved for particularly annoying insects. "Your presence in this sector is no longer tolerable. You will evacuate all colonies and outposts within 30 standard days, or we will remove you ourselves." the transmission ended. Morrison looked around his command center at the faces of officers who had spent their entire careers preparing for war, only to discover that all their preparation was worse than useless. They were outclassed, outgunned, and completely out of their depth. "Options?" he asked. The silence that followed was the kind that made everyone suddenly very interested in their instrument panels. Finally, his tactical officer spoke up. "Sir, with respect, we need to consider unconventional approaches. Our standard doctrine is clearly inadequate against Helix technology." Morrison nodded slowly. "Recommendations?" "There's a cadet at the Naval Academy," the officer said hesitantly. "Annika. Word is she has some unique perspectives on tactical theory." Morrison's expression suggested he was wondering if his career had finally reached the point where he was seriously considering advice from someone who hadn't even graduated yet. "A cadet," he repeated. "Yes, sir. Commander Harry speaks very highly of her analytical abilities." Morrison closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining to Fleet Command that humanity's survival might depend on the insights of a student who was probably younger than his service record. "Get her here," he said finally, "and God help us all." Back at the academy, Annika was in her natural habitat, specifically the back corner of Advanced Fleet Tactics, where she had achieved a state of consciousness that could charitably be described as minimally present. Professor Williams was discussing the finer points of sensor array deployment when Annika's peaceful slumber was interrupted by the kind of dream that made her previous nightmares look like pleasant diversions. She saw fleets burning, not human fleets, but something else entirely. Ships that moved with fluid grace, adapting and evolving their tactics in real time. She watched traditional battle formations crumble like sand castles, saw perfectly executed maneuvers rendered useless by an enemy that seemed to know what you were going to do before you did it yourself. And then she saw something else. A pattern in the chaos. A weakness hidden within the enemy's greatest strength. It was subtle, so subtle that it would be invisible to conventional tactical analysis, but it was there. Annika woke up with a gasp that made half the class turn to look at her. "Miss?" Professor Williams asked, pausing mid-lecture. "Are you all right?" Before Annika could answer, the classroom door burst open, and a young lieutenant, practically, sprinted into the room. "Cadet Annika," the lieutenant said, slightly out of breath. "Admiral Morrison requests your immediate presence in Fleet Command." The classroom went dead silent. Professor Williams looked like someone had just informed him that his lecture on sensor arrays had been nominated for a prestigious award by beings from another dimension. "I'm sorry," Williams said slowly, "but did you just say that Fleet Command is requesting a cadet?" The lieutenant nodded, looking like he couldn't quite believe it himself. Annika stood up, still slightly disoriented from her dream. Around her, her classmates stared with expressions ranging from awe to complete bewilderment. She gathered her things with the mechanical precision of someone who was still processing what was happening. "Annika," Bree whispered, as her roommate walked past. "What did you do?" Annika paused at the door and looked back at her friend. "I think," she said quietly, "I'm about to find out if my dreams are worth anything in the real world." Fleet Command Headquarters was the kind of place that made you automatically straighten your posture and check your uniform for wrinkles, even if you were just delivering pizza. It was all gleaming metal surfaces, holographic displays showing the positions of ships across known space, and the sort of hushed, urgent atmosphere that suggested very important people were making very important decisions that would affect the lives of billions. Annika walked through the corridors feeling distinctly out of place. Her cadet uniform which had seemed perfectly adequate back at the academy, now felt like she was wearing a child's costume to a grown-up party. Officers with more ribbons than chest space bustled past her, their faces carrying the kind of grim determination that suggested the pizza delivery theory was probably optimistic. The lieutenant who'd collected her from class, Rodriguez, according to his name tag, led her through a maze of corridors that seemed designed by someone who'd read too many spy novels and thought that making buildings unnecessarily complicated was somehow strategic. "First time in Fleet Command?" Rodriguez asked, apparently noticing her wide-eyed expression. "First time anywhere that matters," Annika replied honestly. Rodriguez almost smiled at that. "Trust me, cadet. After today, you're going to have a very different definition of mattering." They stopped in front of a door marked Strategic Operations Center, in letters that managed to look both official and vaguely threatening. Rodriguez paused with his hand on the access panel. "Word of advice," he said quietly. "Admiral Morrison is old school. He's been fighting battles since before you were born, and he's not particularly thrilled about asking a cadet for tactical advice. Try not to take it personally if he seems skeptical." "How skeptical are we talking about?" Annika asked. "Let's just say he used the phrase, 'What fresh hell is this?' approximately 6 times during the briefing where your name came up." Encouraging. Rodriguez activated the door panel, and Annika got her first look at the nerve center of human military operations. The Strategic Operations Center was a vast circular room dominated by a holographic display that showed the current tactical situation in 3 dimensions. Ships, represented by glowing icons, moved across the display like pieces on an impossibly complex chessboard. Around the perimeter of the room, workstations hummed with activity as officers analyzed intelligence reports, coordinated supply lines, and tried to make sense of an enemy that seemed to operate by entirely different rules than anything in their training manuals. At the center of it all stood Admiral Morrison, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and then given a uniform that had seen better decades. He was studying the holographic display with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for people trying to defuse bombs or solve complex mathematical proofs, which, Annika reflected, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Morrison looked up as they approached, and Annika found herself on the receiving end of a gaze that could have been used to cut glass. "Cadet Annika," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior officers automatically stand straighter. "I've been told you have some unconventional insights into tactical theory." "So I've been told, sir," Annika replied, which was probably the safest response she could manage under the circumstances. Morrison gestured toward the holographic display. "Then perhaps you can explain to me how we're supposed to fight an enemy that seems to know what we're going to do before we do it." Annika studied the display, taking in the positions of human and helix forces. The picture it painted was not encouraging. Human fleets were scattered across a dozen systems, trying to maintain defensive positions around key colonies. The helix forces, meanwhile, were advancing in a coordinated pattern that suggested they had a much better grasp of overall strategy than their opponents. "They're not reading your minds," Annika said after a moment. "They're reading your doctrine." Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Elaborate." "Every move you make follows established tactical principles," Annika continued, warming to the subject. "Maintain formation integrity, protect supply lines, engage at maximum effective range. The problem is, those principles are predictable. If I know how you've been trained to think, I can anticipate your responses to any given situation." "And your solution is what, exactly? Abandon 3 centuries of military doctrine?" "Not abandon," Annika said. Subvert. Use their expectations against them. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying both the display and the young woman who'd just suggested that everything he'd learned about warfare might be fundamentally flawed. Show me, he said finally. Annika approached the holographic controls with the kind of careful precision that suggested she was acutely aware that she was about to either prove her worth or make herself look like a complete fool in front of the most senior military officers in human space. Here, she said, highlighting a section of the display where a human fleet was currently retreating from a superior Helix force. Admiral Blake is falling back to regroup at the Centauri defense grid. Textbook tactical withdrawal. Perfectly executed. And, Morrison prompted, and completely predictable. The Helix are already moving to intercept him at the grid, because that's obviously where he's going. Annika manipulated the display, showing projected enemy movements. They'll arrive first, set up a crossfire pattern, and destroy his fleet when it tries to take a defensive position. Blake himself was present in the command center, and he stepped forward with the expression of someone who'd just been told his perfectly reasonable plan was actually a death sentence. "What would you suggest, Cadet?" Blake asked, his tone managing to convey both genuine curiosity and barely concealed irritation. Annika studied the display for another moment, then began highlighting different areas. False retreat. Instead of falling back to the defense grid, Admiral Blake continues his withdrawal past the grid, making it look like he's abandoning the system entirely. Abandoning Centauri? Blake's voice rose slightly. There are 15 million civilians on those worlds. Who will all die if your fleet gets destroyed? Annika pointed out with the kind of brutal practicality that made career officers uncomfortable. But you're not actually abandoning anything. You're creating a tactical deception. She manipulated the display again, showing new fleet positions. The Helix will move to occupy the defense grid, because that's the logical strategic objective. They'll expect you to eventually return with reinforcements to try to retake it. But instead of reinforcing, you circle back through the outer system and hit their supply lines. Morrison leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Go on. The Helix have been advancing fast and hard, Annika continued. That means extended supply chains and limited opportunities for resupply. Force them to divert ships to protect their logistics, and suddenly their numerical advantage starts to erode. And if they don't divert ships? Blake asked. Annika smiled, and there was something distinctly predatory about the expression. Then you destroy their supply convoys and watch their fleet run out of fuel, ammunition, and food. Either way, you've turned their strength into a weakness. The command center had gone very quiet. Officers who'd spent their careers learning to think in terms of direct confrontation and defensive positions were suddenly grappling with the concept of warfare as elaborate psychological manipulation. It's risky, Morrison said finally. Everything's risky now, Annika replied. The question is whether you want to take calculated risks or just keep doing what hasn't been working and hope for different results. Morrison turned to Blake. Admiral, your thoughts? Blake stared at the display for a long moment, clearly wrestling with decades of ingrained military thinking. It's completely contrary to established doctrine, he said slowly, and it just might work. What followed was the kind of controlled chaos that happens when military organizations try to implement completely new strategies under extreme time pressure. Messages flew between fleet commands, supply officers frantically recalculated logistics requirements, and communications specialists worked to establish secure channels for coordinating the deception. Annika found herself in the surreal position of being the most junior person in a room full of admirals, while simultaneously being the one everyone was looking to for guidance. It was like being asked to conduct a symphony orchestra when your only musical experience was humming in the shower. The first test came 18 hours later. Blake's fleet, instead of making the expected stand at the Centauri defense grid, continued its withdrawal into deep space. Long-range sensors showed the Helix fleet moving to occupy the grid, exactly as Annika had predicted. "Phase 2, Morrison said, looking at Annika expectantly. She nodded and turned to the communications officer. "Signal Admiral Blake. Begin the supply line raids." What happened next would be analyzed in military academies for decades to come. Blake's fleet, moving through the outer system in small, fast-moving task forces, systematically began destroying Helix supply convoys. The enemy had been so focused on their primary advance that they'd left their logistics vulnerable. The effect was immediate and devastating. Helix forces at the defense grid, suddenly cut off from resupply, found themselves in an increasingly untenable position. They could hold the grid, but they couldn't advance without fuel and ammunition. Worse, they couldn't retreat without admitting that a supposedly inferior human fleet had outmaneuvered them. "They're moving ships back to protect their supply lines," Rodriguez reported, monitoring the tactical display. "Just like you predicted." Annika nodded, but her expression was troubled. "It's working too well." Morrison looked at her sharply. "Explain." "The Helix adapted to our conventional tactics within hours during the first engagement," Annika said. "But they've been following predictable patterns for 2 days now. Either they're not as adaptable as we thought, or they're setting a trap," Morrison finished grimly. Before Annika could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the command center. The holographic display flashed red as new contacts appeared on the long-range sensors. "Admiral," the sensor officer called out, his voice tight with tension, "we have multiple Helix fleets entering the system. Mass readings suggest—" "Sir, it looks like their entire battle group." Morrison stared at the display as dozens of new enemy contacts materialized. The fleet they'd been fighting wasn't the main Helix force. It was a scouting element. And now the real army had arrived. "How many ships?" Morrison asked quietly. "Conservative estimate, sir?" 800 vessels. Possibly more." The command center fell silent. 800 ships represented roughly 10 times the total military capacity of human space. Even if every human vessel had been concentrated in one place, which they weren't, the odds would have been hopeless. Annika studied the display, watching as the massive Helix armada arranged itself in attack formations. Something was bothering her, something beyond the obvious problem of being outnumbered 10-1. "Admiral," she said slowly, "I need to see the intelligence reports on Helix military organization." Morrison nodded to an aide, who quickly pulled up the relevant files. Annika scanned through the data, her expression growing increasingly puzzled. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. "What doesn't make sense?" Morrison asked. "The Helix are supposed to be an adaptive military force. Flexible tactics, rapid response to changing battlefield conditions. But bringing 800 ships to crush a handful of human colonies? That's not adaptive thinking. That's overwhelming force applied without subtlety or tactical consideration." Morrison frowned. "You're saying they're not as smart as we thought?" "I'm saying they're not behaving like the enemy that destroyed our fleet 3 days ago," Annika replied. "Either we're missing something fundamental about their strategic thinking, or we're not fighting the same opponent." The holographic display chimed with an incoming transmission. General Korth's unpleasant features appeared on the main screen, looking even more smug than during his previous communication. Humans, Korth said, his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment. You have proven more troublesome than anticipated. This ends now. Surrender unconditionally, and your deaths will be swift. The transmission ended. Morrison looked around the command center at faces that ranged from determined to terrified. Options? The silence that followed was broken by Annika's quiet voice. We run. Every head in the room turned toward her. We run, she repeated, louder this time. Full evacuation. Every civilian, every military asset, everything we can save. We abandon the outer colonies and fall back to the core systems. That's not a strategy, Blake protested. That's surrender. No, Annika said, her voice carrying a conviction that made everyone pay attention. That's survival. And right now, survival is the only victory we can achieve. Morrison stared at her for a long moment. You're suggesting we abandon everything we've built out here. I'm suggesting we live to fight another day, Annika replied. The Helix want to destroy us quickly and decisively. But if we refuse to give them that decisive battle, if we make them chase us across half the galaxy while we hit their supply lines and evacuate our people, then maybe we can find a way to turn their strength against them. And if we can't? Morrison asked. Annika met his gaze steadily. Then, at least we'll have saved as many people as possible before the end. The next 18 hours were a masterpiece of organized chaos. The largest evacuation in human history began, with civilian transports and military vessels working around the clock to evacuate key personnel and resources from the outer colonies. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't glorious, and it certainly wasn't the kind of heroic last stand that military historians would write songs about. But it worked. By the time the Helix fleet arrived at the abandoned colonies, they found empty worlds and vacant space stations. The humans had vanished like ghosts, leaving behind nothing but empty buildings and the kind of tactical puzzle that was guaranteed to frustrate even the most patient general. Annika stood in the command center, watching as the last evacuation convoy jumped to hyperspace. Around her, officers were already beginning to plan the next phase of what had become the strangest military campaign in human history. What now? Morrison asked. Annika smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested the girl who'd slept through strategy class was beginning to wake up. Now, she said, we find out what the Helix do when their enemies refuse to stay still long enough to be properly conquered. 3 months into what historians would later call the Great Retreat, Annika had acquired 2 things she'd never expected: a promotion to lieutenant commander and a reputation that made veteran officers either worship her tactical genius or question her fundamental sanity. Sometimes, both at the same time. She was also, much to everyone's surprise, winning. Not in the traditional sense, of course. The Helix still controlled most of human space. Their massive fleets had occupied every major colony world, and their supply lines stretched across hundreds of systems like a vast mechanical spiderweb. By any conventional measure, humanity was losing catastrophically. But conventional measures, as Annika had repeatedly demonstrated, were for people who enjoyed being predictable. Status report, Admiral Morrison said, as he entered the mobile command center that had become humanity's new seat of government. The fact that their capital was now a heavily modified cargo freighter, jumping between systems every few days, would have been humiliating under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. General Korth is having what our intelligence analysts are diplomatically calling a very bad day. Annika replied, manipulating the holographic tactical display with the casual expertise of someone who'd spent the last 3 months turning military doctrine inside out. His supply convoys are 3 weeks behind schedule. His forward bases keep mysteriously exploding, and approximately 60% of his field commanders have submitted requests for additional psychological counseling. Morrison almost smiled at that. Almost. And our losses? Minimal. We've lost more personnel to transfer requests than to enemy action. Annika highlighted several areas on the display. Turns out, a lot of our people aren't comfortable with warfare that involves running away and setting things on fire. Can't imagine why, Morrison said dryly. Any word from the home fleet? Annika's expression darkened slightly. Admiral Winters is still advocating for a direct assault on the Helix home system. She believes our cowardly hit-and-run tactics are unworthy of human military tradition. Winters always was fond of glorious defeats, Morrison muttered. What's our actual strategic position? Better than it looks. Worse than we'd like, Annika said, bringing up a new section of the display. The Helix are stretched thin, trying to hold territory they never expected to occupy this long. They're burning through supplies faster than they can replenish them, and their commanders are making increasingly desperate decisions. Define desperate. Yesterday, they used orbital bombardment on a planet that was already evacuated because they thought our evacuation ships might have been decoys hiding a secret military base. Annika shook her head. They wasted enough ordnance to supply a small war on empty buildings and confused livestock. Morrison studied the display, noting the positions of various human and Helix forces. After 3 months of what amounted to the galaxy's most elaborate game of hide-and-seek, he was beginning to understand why Annika's unorthodox approach was working. The Helix had been prepared to fight a conventional war against a conventional enemy. They had not been prepared to fight ghosts. There's something else, Annika said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I've been analyzing their tactical responses over the past month, and I'm seeing a pattern. What kind of pattern? Annika manipulated the display, showing a series of recent engagements. They're learning, not just adapting to our tactics, but actually learning from them. 3 weeks ago, they would have sent their entire fleet to chase one of our raiding groups. Now, they're using smaller, faster pursuit forces and keeping their main strength concentrated. Morrison frowned. That's actually intelligent tactical thinking. Which brings us back to the question that's been bothering me since this whole thing started, Annika said. The Helix forces we fought in the beginning were adaptable and intelligent. The massive fleet that showed up afterward was overwhelming, but tactically crude. And now we're seeing evidence of genuine strategic learning. Your point? I think we're fighting at least 3 different enemies, and they're all calling themselves the Helix Consortium. Before Morrison could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the command center. Rodriguez burst through the doorway with the kind of urgent expression that suggested someone had just discovered something very unwelcome. "Admiral, we have a problem," Rodriguez said, slightly out of breath. "Long-range sensors are detecting a massive fleet movement in the core systems. It's Admiral Winters. She's launched her assault on the Helix home system." Morrison closed his eyes and uttered the kind of curse that would have made his old drill instructor proud. "How many ships?" "Everything, sir. The entire home fleet, plus colonial militia units, plus what looks like impressed civilian vessels. Conservative estimate, 400 ships." "Against how many Helix vessels?" Rodriguez consulted his datapad. "Intelligence suggests the home system is defended by approximately all of them, sir." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either brilliant tactical innovations or complete military disasters. Given humanity's recent track record, Morrison wasn't feeling optimistic about which one this was going to be. "Options?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "We can try to support Admiral Winters with our remaining mobile forces," Rodriguez offered. "Combined with her fleet, we might be able to accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed," Annika finished. "Admiral Winters is walking into exactly the kind of conventional fleet engagement the Helix have been hoping for since this war started. They're going to destroy her completely." Morrison turned to face her. "And your recommendation?" Annika stared at the tactical display for a long moment, her expression cycling through what looked like frustration, calculation, and something that might have been the beginning of a very dangerous idea. "We let her go," Annika said finally. "I'm sorry. What?" "Admiral Winters wants to fight a traditional fleet engagement. The Helix want to fight a traditional fleet engagement. Let them have their traditional fleet engagement." Annika's smile was the kind that made smart people start looking for the exits. "While they're busy destroying each other, we'll be implementing Plan B." "We have a Plan B?" Morrison asked. "We do now," Annika replied. "And the best part is, it's going to work, because nobody, not Admiral Winters, not General Korth, not anyone in either fleet, is going to see it coming." Morrison stared at her for a moment, trying to decide if the young woman who'd revolutionized human military strategy had finally lost her mind, or if she was about to prove once again that the most dangerous opponent was the one who refused to fight by anyone else's rules. "Explain," he said. Annika's grin widened. "Admiral, how do you feel about ending this war in a way that's going to make military historians very, very confused?" Admiral Winters's fleet lasted exactly 43 minutes against the assembled might of the Helix Consortium. It was, by all accounts, a magnificent defeat, the kind that gets commemorated in stirring monuments and tragic poetry. The home fleet fought with courage, honor, and all the tactical precision their training had instilled in them, none of which mattered when facing an enemy that had spent months studying human military doctrine. But while the galaxy's attention was focused on the spectacular destruction happening in the Helix home system, something far more interesting was occurring in the empty space between systems. Something that General Korth, busy savoring his greatest victory, completely failed to notice until it was far too late. Annika had been right about the Helix Consortium. They weren't one enemy. They were three distinct factions operating under a single banner. The original adaptive force that had nearly destroyed humanity's first fleet. The massive, brutal armada that preferred overwhelming force to tactical subtlety. And a third group that had been quietly learning from every human innovation, studying every tactical development, and preparing for the moment when they could demonstrate their own strategic evolution. What none of them had anticipated was that their greatest enemy wasn't Admiral Winters with her traditional fleet tactics. It wasn't even the mobile forces that had been harassing their supply lines for months. It was a sleepy cadet who had spent 4 years absorbing tactical knowledge through her dreams and 3 months teaching an entire military how to fight dirty. While the Helix celebrated their victory and consolidated their forces in their home system, Annika's carefully positioned evacuation fleets revealed their true nature. They weren't refugees filled with civilians and supplies. They were weapons, every single one of them. The cargo ships contained enough antimatter charges to sterilize planets. The medical transports were actually advanced electronic warfare platforms. The civilian evacuation vessels were crewed by the most experienced special operations personnel in human space, all of whom had spent months learning to think like Annika. and every single one of these disguised weapons was now positioned throughout Helix space, having spent months moving into position while everyone assumed they were just part of humanity's desperate retreat. "Execute phase final," Annika said quietly into her communicator. What happened next would be debated by military philosophers for centuries. In the span of 18 minutes, the entire Helix war machine simply stopped working. Supply depots exploded. Communication networks went dark. Command centers found their computer systems infected with viruses that displayed nothing but images of sleeping cats. Fuel refineries, ammunition factories, and ship repair facilities all suffered mysterious, catastrophic failures. The Helix consortium, which had conquered half the galaxy through superior technology and tactical adaptation, discovered that all their advantages meant nothing when their enemy refused to be conquered and instead focused on making their lives systematically miserable. General Korth's final transmission was brief. "We surrender." The ceremony was held 6 months later in the rebuilt Academy Lecture Hall where it had all started. Admiral Morrison stood at the podium, delivering remarks about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of unconventional thinking in modern warfare. In the third row, Lieutenant Commander Annika slept peacefully through the entire thing. When Morrison reached the part about presenting her with humanity's highest military honor, Bree, now promoted to captain, delivered a perfectly timed elbow to her roommate's ribs. Annika woke up, accepted her medal with appropriate dignity, and immediately fell back asleep during the closing remarks. Some things, Morrison reflected with amusement, never changed. And frankly, he wouldn't have it any other way. After all, who knew what she might be dreaming up next?